To get from this contour map to the actual carved object, I think you've got two main options. The first being you could do the lamination as we did in part 1, and then carve the design into it using this as a reference. And the second would be to use the CNC to carve the design into the sheets before they get glued up. And that's the way I did it. There were three main problems that needed to be solved with this. The first being that as you go from the inside to the outside of this, each layer needs to get a little bit longer. And so the design also has to be scaled to match that. Now, since I had already made the bending form, I was able to just get a direct measurement of what that change in length needed to be right off of the form. And that ended up being about 7/8 of an inch. Now, technically, if you just scale the design by that 7/8 of an inch, it's not going to be really accurate because the amount of change is localized to these areas with the sharp curves and not so much in the parts that are almost straight. But for our purposes, it's close enough. The second problem is that the layers need to hold together while they're being bent around the form. So what I'm looking for is basically a dotted line around the edges. And the way I accomplished that was to use a ridiculous amount of tabs. The only problem is that I tried to have the tabs in strategic locations, but whenever you edit the vector, it either deletes the tabs or moves them around on you. To show the areas that needed to be removed, I just had it drill lots of holes in those areas. There didn't need to be that many on the top layer because you can see what's going on. But as you go in deeper, you need more visual clues. And finally, I needed some way to keep the layers aligned with each other during the glue up. I put one set of holes in the same spot in each layer near the middle so I could use a dowel to force the alignment. And so I could tell which hole was the right hole, I put the other holes in a circle around it. In practice, it ended up being a real pain to try to get it onto the dowel, so I ended up just putting a mark on the edge, and I was able to get it close enough. So in a staggering coincidence, I just happened to make a tilting power carving workbench, which sure is handy for trying to carve a big triangle. To remove the bulk of the material, I'm using the Arbortech turbo plane for the first time. The big question I had was how controllable was it? I knew it would be able to hog off a lot of material, but I didn't know how fine you could be with it. What I was trying to do was remove one layer of the plywood at a time, going just beneath the glue line. I found that I could get down really close to that glue line really quickly and easily, and then just sort of lightly brush it over the surface, and it would go just barely past that glue line. So that worked out great. On my first attempt, I would just keep working in one area all the way through the 4 layers. This got really confusing. It was hard to tell how deep any one area was, and thus whether I was supposed to be, keep trying to go through that spot or whether I was supposed to stop there. So I learned it was better to work one layer at a time and go into all the details on that layer and sort of remove all traces of that dotted line before going on to the next layer. For the finer details, I was using a 2-inch burr disc in the mini grinder. Originally, I had way too much detail in the design that was smaller than what I could do with this. I could get into some fairly tight spaces with the grinder turned vertical, but there were a lot of places where even that wasn't enough. I could go to the flex shaft and use a small burr to get into those areas, but that's a lot slower, so I really tried to minimize that and only use that in really important places. The first one of these I did was one of my very early attempts at the glue up process. And as I did the carving, it exposed gaps all over the place. Not only did I not have the process down yet, but also the plywood broke in some of the tight bends. To fix that, I made my tabs taller, and I also added another sheet on the outside with packing tape all over one side so the glue wouldn't stick to it. And I didn't attempt to do this version again until I really had that process down. So in my later attempts, I really only had one problem area in a few of them. It was a big relief to carve into the whole thing and not see any of those gaps. Even though I knew the first attempt was not going to be a keeper, I brought it all the way to a near finished state so I could really see how it was going to look. Now, I liked how it looked from the sides, but I didn't like how it looked from the front. The case makes a frame around the box, and it just didn't look right that it had these sort of cutouts into it in random places that didn't really make any sense. So I modified the design so that it only cuts into the front in one spot, and that's going to make sense later. And it doesn't cut into the back as much, but it does cut into it more than the front. Also, my favorite aspect of the design was this swirl, and so I added in a couple more swirls in different places. I haven't done the really fine details that I need to do with the flex shaft, and I have to sand them. And I'm really not looking forward to sanding them, so I'm putting that off.